Imagine trying to cram all the computational data of a hyperscale AI data center through like a single physical copper wire.
Yeah, that would be a disaster.
Right. I mean, at the data rates we're looking at for next generation chips, the resistance alone would generate enough heat to literally melt the connection.
Oh, absolutely. It would just fry.
So that physical bottleneck, the absolute limit of electrical signaling, is the reason the entire semiconductor industry is, quietly abandoning traditional organic substrates.
They're moving to glass.
Exactly. And today, we're looking at the one obscure company that appears to be holding the monopoly on the drill. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
For you listening, our mission today is to give you a shortcut to understanding a highly specialized, rapidly moving corner of the tech manufacturing world.
Because it is moving incredibly fast.
It really is. We're breaking down a massive shift in advanced packaging without getting bogged down in, the textbook minutia.
Right. We want you fully equipped with the underlying mechanics and the market timeline of this transition.
Because when the industry pivots from moving electrons over copper to moving photons through glass, the entire supply chain gets upended.
It's a total paradigm shift.
Yeah.
You need to know who controls the critical nodes of that new infrastructure.
To do that, we have a short but incredibly dense stack of notes to go through today.
Very dense.
Yeah, we're looking at excerpts from an analyst's personal research, a direct quote from an industry figure simply identified as Lee, and a highly specific news snippet regarding a publicly traded company called LPKF Laser and Electronics SE.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
It is. But our goal is to decode what our source explicitly describes as a critical monopoly choke point in semiconductor manufacturing.
And, the phrase monopoly choke point is thrown around casually in investor circles all the time.
Yeah, usually just to describe a company with, a slight edge in market share.
Exactly. But in semiconductor equipment, a true choke point means you own the foundational physics of a mandatory process.
There's no way around it.
None. If you want to play in the next generation of computing, you have to pay their toll.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get into the financial hype or, the cloak and dagger secrecy in these notes, we really have to establish the physical reality of the technology.
We have to know what we're actually looking at.
Right. So our news snippet focuses on LPKF Laser and Electronics SE, stating they have completed preparations for co-packaged optics technologies, or CPO.
CPO, yeah.
It specifically notes that they supply the equipment capable of forming 3D optical waveguides directly inside glass substrates, and these are used for advanced packaging.
And those terms, right, co-packaged optics, 3D waveguides, glass substrates, they basically represent the holy grail of solving what the industry calls the interconnect bottleneck.
Okay, so the bottleneck we mentioned earlier.
Exactly, because for decades we've mounted silicon chips on organic substrates like FR4, or we've used silicon interposers to route the electrical signals between chips.
Right.
But as transistor density has just skyrocketed, the electrical pathways have become parasitic.
Parasitic capacitance.
Exactly. The signals interfere with each other, they degrade over distance, and, the resistance generates massive thermal loads.
So the substrate essentially just becomes a giant heating element.
It does, which forces chip designers to throttle performance just to keep the package from warping or, frying completely.
Wow. So they're holding back the chips just to protect the packaging.
Yeah, and that's where glass substrates come in. They solve the structural and thermal issues.
How so?
Well, glass has a highly tunable coefficient of thermal expansion, meaning you can match it perfectly to the silicon die, so they expand and contract together without warping.
Oh, that makes sense.
Plus, it's incredibly flat, which allows for significantly higher interconnect density.
Mm.
But the real paradigm shift is the CPO aspect.
The co-packaged optics.
Right. You're no longer converting an optical signal from a fiber optic cable into an electrical signal at the edge of the board and then routing that electricity to the chip. You are bringing the optical signal, the actual light, directly into the substrate, right next to the silicon.
Wow. Which brings us to the waveguides. Because when I read the phrase 3D optical waveguides inside glass, I visualize it like building a microscopic, three-dimensional fiber optic superhighway system.
That's a really good way to picture it.
Like you've got overpasses, off-ramps, tunnels, but the entire network is permanently trapped inside a solid pane of window glass.
It's wild to think about.
It is. So what does this all mean? Why is doing this inside glass substrates considered a critical monopoly choke point?
Because, I mean, we've been manipulating glass for millennia.
What's fascinating here is the physics of how those microscopic superhighways are actually constructed.
Okay.
Because you can't just drill a physical hole through the glass at a submicron level and, like, thread a fiber optic cable through it.
Right. That'd be impossible.
Yeah, the waveguide has to be created out of the glass itself.
Out of the glass? Yes. And that requires altering the refractive index of the internal glass matrix without shattering or microcracking the surrounding material.
Wait, really? So you aren't removing material?
No, not at all.
You're just changing how the existing material bends light.
Precisely. It's done through a process known as nonlinear multiphoton absorption.
Okay, that sounds like sci-fi.
It kind of is. You use an ultra-short pulse femtosecond laser. You focus that laser incredibly tightly, not on the surface of the glass, but deep inside the core.
Deep inside. Oh.
Right. And at the exact focal point, the intensity of the light is so extreme that it triggers a localized plasma microexplosion.
A microexplosion inside the glass.
Inside the solid glass. This permanently densifies the glass at that specific microscopic coordinate, which changes its refractive index.
Wow.
And by moving the laser focus in 3 dimensions, you essentially draw a continuous channel that traps and guides light.
So the light beam becomes the physical pathway for future light to travel through.
Exactly. It acts exactly like the core of a fiber optic cable, but it's seamlessly integrated into the solid substrate.
And this brings us to why the source calls LPKF the monopoly choke point. Because LPKF isn't selling the glass, right?
No, they don't make the glass.
And they aren't designing the AI chips.
No.
They hold the foundational patents and the proprietary equipment for that specific high-yield femtosecond laser process.
Right. They are the company that figured out how to steer that laser with the speed and precision required to make 3D waveguides commercially viable.
Commercially viable at a mass manufacturing scale.
Exactly. It's an equipment play.
Which makes the human element of our research notes incredibly compelling.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the tone of the source material suddenly shifts from these highly technical specifications into this, like, guarded corporate espionage territory.
It gets very secretive.
It does. We have this quote from an industry figure identified only as Lee.
Just Lee.
Sister Lee. And the quote reads, "About 4 years ago, we began collaborating with a semiconductor company to develop mass production equipment for direct 3D waveguide formation."
4 years ago.
Yeah. And the author of the notes adds a massive detail. They write, "The customer has already installed LPKF's equipment."
And that is huge.
Yeah.
Because the transition from theoretical lab science to a physical machine operating on a factory floor that is the hardest gap to cross in the semiconductor industry.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Most novel packaging technologies just die in the lab because they can't scale.
Yeah. So, the source author goes on to speculate about who this mysterious customer is, guessing maybe Samsung or SKC Epsilix, since this was in Korea.
Right, that's the speculation.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me, and, I have to push back on the author's logic regarding the secrecy.
Okay, what do you mean?
If this equipment is a massive laser system and the customer has already installed it, why all the cloak and dagger? Furthermore, if LPKF is openly putting out press releases about supplying this equipment and executives named Lee are giving quotes, isn't the cat out of the bag?
You would think so.
Right. Like, how can a company like SKC Epsilix claim a massive competitive advantage if their supplier is openly bragging to the global market about the technology? Couldn't, I don't know, TSMC or Intel just call LPKF tomorrow and buy the same machine?
That's a great question, but buying the hardware is only about 10% of the battle.
Really? Just 10%?
Yeah. Think of the semiconductor equipment market like buying a high-end commercial bakery oven.
Okay.
LPKF is selling the oven, and they are thrilled to tell investors they've finally delivered their first unit.
Right. They want the stock bump.
Exactly. But the customer, whether it's Samsung, SKC, or another major foundry, isn't just plugging the oven in.
Right.
They are spending years developing the proprietary recipe, the raw material supply chains, the exact temperature curves, and, the integration of that oven into a continuous automated factory line.
Oh, I see. So the machine is basically useless without the manufacturing process flow built around it?
That is the essence of the 4-year collaboration Lee is talking about.
So it takes 4 years just to figure out how to use the machine.
In semiconductor manufacturing, yes. That 4-year window represents the qualification pilot phase. And it is a grueling, iterative cycle.
Like trial and error?
Lots of error.
Yeah.
You run test wafers, you measure the optical signal loss, you find out that your laser alignment is off by like 2 nanometers, which causes a bottleneck.
Wow, 2 nanometers.
Yeah. You adjust the substrate chemistry. The customer works under ironclad non-disclosure agreements with the equipment supplier to modify the machine for their specific proprietary yield requirements.
So the secret isn't that LPKF makes a laser.
No.
The secret is the yield rate, the defect density, and the exact integration metrics that the Korean foundry has spent 4 years perfecting behind closed doors.
Exactly. So when a competitor eventually buys that same LPKF machine, they don't get the 4 years of process knowledge.
They just get the oven.
Right. They have to start their own qualification cycle entirely from scratch.
Oh, wow.
And in the geopolitical tech race we're currently in, where Korea is aggressively trying to leapfrog Taiwan, and the U.S. in advanced packaging, a 4-year head start on integrating glass substrates and co-packaged optics, is an almost insurmountable moat.
It's massive.
The fact that the equipment is already installed proves they've moved past the R&D feasibility stage.
Yeah.
They're currently locking down the mass production parameters.
That physical reality, the equipment actually sitting on the floor, perfectly contextualizes the market timing outlined in the next part of our notes.
Yeah, the timing is critical.
Because the author gets incredibly candid about tracking this technology. They write that they flagged it as a potential 10x back in Jan, but thought it was too early.
Too early back in January.
Right. But now, they write, time seems right now. They compare the momentum to a stock ticker, AEHR, specifically noting its behavior pre-earnings. And they project that this tech is in the transition phase, like moving out of the pilot stage and heading toward high-volume mass production, which is targeted for 2027.
And that comparison to AEHR is incredibly telling for anyone who tracks semiconductor equipment.
Why is that?
So AEHR Test Systems makes burn-in test equipment for silicon carbide chips.
Okay.
For years, they were a relatively stagnant stock. But when the electric vehicle market hit an inflection point, and suddenly every automaker needed silicon carbide, AEHR's valuation exploded.
Because they were already set up.
Right, they were the incumbent qualified equipment provider.
They were the toll booth that was already built before the traffic arrived.
That's exactly the dynamic the source is anticipating for LPKF. The pre-earnings phrasing implies that the massive revenue from high-volume orders hasn't hit LPKF's balance sheet yet.
Because the foundries are still finishing up their pilot lines?
Precisely. But the market is waking up. The market is realizing that the physics of AI data centers will force the adoption of glass substrates.
There's just no other way.
And when that demand fully materializes, LPKF will be the only equipment vendor with a proven 4-year qualification track record.
I know it's a bit of a standard market metaphor, but this timeline really tracks with the life cycle of an indie band.
Okay, an indie band. I like it.
Yeah, so the 4-year pilot phase is the band locked in the garage, endlessly tweaking the acoustics, dealing with blown amps. Nobody knows what they're doing except industry insiders.
Right.
And the 2027 high-volume phase is the sold-out stadium tour.
The big leagues.
Exactly. But the underlying question here is about risk pricing. As an observer, for you listening, is this messy middle transition phase actually the most crucial time to pay attention, like before the 2027 high volume kicks in?
Oh, without doubt.
Because the risk of failure is lower than it was in the garage, but the stadium tickets aren't priced into the stock yet.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are describing the precise inflection point of the technology S-curve.
Okay.
The messy middle is where exponential value is unlocked for investors who understand the mechanics of scaling.
Because 2027 is the target for high volume manufacturing, or HVM.
Right. And in the semiconductor world, transitioning to HVM means you have proven that your defect density is low enough to make a profit.
So the yield is economically viable.
Exactly. But the market doesn't wait for 2027 to price in that viability.
When do they price it in?
Once the pilot line demonstrates acceptable yield, the foundries start placing massive purchase orders to build out their billion-dollar glass substrate facilities.
Oh, so the orders happen way before the high volume starts.
Yes. That equipment order backlog is the leading indicator. The pre-earnings momentum the source is feeling is the realization that the technical risk, the fear that maybe lasers just couldn't carve glass efficiently enough, that risk has been retired.
It's proven it works.
Right. The remaining risk is purely execution and scaling.
Recognizing that shift from technical risk to execution risk is really the ultimate shortcut.
It absolutely is.
Because by the time 2027 rolls around and every major tech publication is running cover stories on how co-packaged optics and glass substrates save the AI revolution, the opportunity to understand the shift on the ground floor is completely gone.
By then, the monopoly Chokepoint will have already exerted its pricing leverage across the entire global supply chain.
So you want to identify the choke point while the foundational patents are still being translated into factory floor mechanics.
Right. Long before the output becomes ubiquitous in our data centers.
Well, let's summarize the terrain we just covered because we navigated some deeply technical infrastructure today.
We really did.
We started with the physical limits of traditional semiconductor packaging,
Mm-hmm.
realizing that organic materials and copper simply cannot handle the thermal loads and data rates of next-generation computing.
Yeah, they're melting.
Exactly. The solution is moving photons through glass substrates via co-packaged optics.
A solution that relies on altering the refractive index of solid glass without breaking it.
Which brought us to the monopoly choke point, LPKF, Laser and Electronics SE. The company controlling the high-yield femtosecond laser equipment necessary to carve those 3D microscopic optical superhighways?
Beautifully put.
Thank you. We then decoded the secrecy surrounding their 4-year collaboration with a likely Korean tech giant, understanding that the real competitive advantage lies not in owning the machine, but in the grueling qualification process of integrating it into an automated line.
Moving from the laboratory theory to a fully qualified high-yield manufacturing flow.
Right. And finally, we mapped the timeline. We are sitting right now in the transition window, tracking the inflection point as the technology clears the pilot phase and ramps toward high-volume mass production in 2027.
And for you listening, this matters because you are now equipped with the vocabulary and the underlying mechanics of a massive shift in tech hardware.
You understand the why and the how of co-packaged optics and glass substrates?
Exactly. It allows you to bypass all the noise and track the actual equipment toll booths being built on the factory floor.
You can follow the capital expenditures of the major foundries and know exactly what infrastructure they are secretly scaling up.
But before we wrap up, there is one final provocative angle to this transition that you should mull over on your own.
Oh, what's that?
Well, our sources today focused almost entirely on the incredible upside, the speculative 10x returns for the company that holds this new monopoly choke point in glass substrate equipment.
Right, because the natural tendency is to fixate on the clear winner of the new paradigm.
Exactly. But technological leaps are inherently destructive.
How so?
Think about it. If this highly specific 3D waveguide technology genuinely becomes the high-volume standard by 2027 to support AI data centers, what happens to the massive globally entrenched supply chains built entirely around the old way of doing things?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
What happens to the material science companies relying on the continued dominance of organic substrates? What happens to the manufacturers churning out specialized copper interconnects?
The entire infrastructure of the bottleneck.
Exactly. How much invisible obsolescence is sitting in the market right now, deeply embedded in tech portfolios and manufacturing pipelines, entirely unaware that the glass revolution has already been successfully installed, qualified, and hidden away on a factory floor in Korea?
That is wild to think about.
Finding the next massive technological leap is lucrative, but realizing what that leap is quietly rendering worthless might be just as vital.
That is a staggering implication for the broader tech market. So next time you're reading about the insatiable power demands of a new AI model, think about those invisible microscopic pathways of light being engineered into glass right now and the massive legacy industries they are about to leave in the dark. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.